The first time Maude Sutton saw Alfred Donovan, he was standing knee-deep in the icy waters of Crooked Creek, wrestling a beaver trap loose from a tangle of roots, and she thought he was the loneliest-looking man she had ever laid eyes upon. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Wyoming territory had turned the color of old pennies, the cottonwoods along the creek shedding their leaves in slow golden drifts. Maude had been traveling for 11 days by stagecoach and wagon from her aunt's home in Ohio, coming west to the town of Split Rock to keep house for her uncle, Silas Whitfield, a widower who ran the general store and had written to say his rheumatism had grown too fierce to manage alone. She had not expected the wagon axle to snap 2 miles outside of town, nor had she expected the driver, a nervous young man named Elias Prine, to go running off toward the nearest ranch for help and leave her sitting on an overturned trunk with her skirts gathering dust and her heart hammering against her ribs. She had not expected, either, to hear the low chuff of a horse's breath behind her and to turn and find a man on a rawbone bay gelding, watching her with eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He did not speak. She would learn in the weeks that followed that this was not a rare occurrence for him, but a permanent state of being, for Alfred Donovan had not spoken a word since he was 19 years old, when a fever had swept through the mining camp where he labored and left him alive but silent, his voice stolen as surely as if some thief in the night had crept in and taken it while he slept. That had been 6 years past. He was 25 now, broad through the shoulders from years of trapping and hauling and hard living, with a face that might have been called handsome if it were not so often set in the careful stillness of a man who has learned to let his eyes do the talking his mouth cannot. He swung down from the bay and approached her slowly, the way a man might approach a spooked colt, palms open and visible. Maude, for her part, gripped the handle of her carpet bag and wondered if she ought to be afraid. But there was nothing in his bearing to frighten her. He inclined his head toward the broken wagon, then toward her, then made a small gesture with his hand, a question without words. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, and her voice came out thinner than she intended. "No, I am quite well, only stranded. The driver has gone for help. I do not know how long he will be." Alfred studied her for a long moment, then walked to the wagon and crouched beside the broken axle, running his fingers along the splintered wood. He shook his head slightly, as if to say the wagon would not be fixed easily, not out here, not without proper tools. Then he stood, dusted his hands against his buckskin trousers, and looked toward the darkening sky, where the last light was draining fast behind the Wind River peaks. "You think night will come before help does," Maude said, because she found she could read something of his meaning in the tilt of his head, though she could not have said how. He nodded. "Well," she said, drawing herself up, for she had not traveled 2,000 miles to be undone by a broken axle and an early dusk, "what do you propose?" He considered her for a long moment, and something almost like amusement crossed his face, quick as a bird's shadow. Then he pointed to his horse and to her, and to the horizon in the direction she knew Split Rock to lie. "You mean to carry me into town?" He nodded again. She hesitated only a moment, weighing the propriety of riding double with a stranger against the plain fact of an oncoming night on the open prairie, with wolves that howled somewhere in the far hills even now, their voices thin and cold on the wind. Propriety lost. She allowed him to help her up onto the bay's back, settling behind the cantle of his saddle, and she gripped the back of his coat as he swung up in front of her, and they rode together through the bluing dusk toward the lights of Split Rock, and neither of them said a word, because one of them could not, and the other did not know what words would fit such a strange and sudden nearness to a man she had known for less than half an hour. It was, though she would not admit it to herself for some weeks yet, the beginning of everything. Split Rock was not much of a town in those years, a scattering of clapboard buildings along a rutted main street, a livery, a church with a steeple that leaned very slightly to the west from a windstorm 2 winters back, and Silas Whitfield's general store with its dusty windows full of tinned goods and bolts of calico. Maude's uncle came hobbling out onto the porch when he heard the horse's hooves, his face folding into worry and then relief when he saw his niece safe, if a little disheveled, sliding down from behind a man he clearly recognized. "Donovan," Silas said, and there was warmth in it, the kind of warmth a man reserves for someone he has known through hard winters. "You found her, then?" Alfred nodded and touched the brim of his hat and made ready to leave, but Silas would not hear of it, insisting the trapper come in for supper as thanks, and it was over that first meal, eaten mostly in silence but for Silas's steady stream of talk, that Maude Sutton learned the shape of Alfred Donovan's life. He had come west from Missouri as a boy of 13 with his father, who had died of a rattlesnake bite 2 summers into their trapping venture, leaving Alfred alone in the mountains at 15 to learn a hard trade the hard way. He had built himself a small cabin up along Crooked Creek, in a fold of the foothills where the beaver were plentiful, and the elk came down in autumn to rut and bugle in the aspen groves. He sold his furs twice a year in Split Rock, and otherwise kept to himself, for what use did a man with no voice have for the company of talkers? "He is the best trapper in 3 counties," Silas said, buttering a biscuit, seemingly unbothered by the fact that Alfred sat listening to his own praises without so much as a change of expression, though Maude thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "Never seen a man read the land the way he does. Knows where the beaver will be before the beaver know it themselves." "How does he sell his furs if he cannot speak the terms?" Maude asked and regretted it at once, worried it sounded unkind, but Alfred only reached into his coat and drew out a small slate and a stub of chalk, which he set upon the table with the unbothered air of a man producing a familiar tool. He wrote upon it, in a neat, careful hand that surprised her, and turned it so she could read, "I write what I need. Folks have learned." "He reads and writes fine," Silas said. "His pa taught him letters before he passed. It is only the talking that fever took from him." Maude looked at the slate, at the words written there, plain and unadorned, and felt something shift in her chest, a curiosity she could not yet name. "I am sorry," she said, "for prying." Alfred shook his head, wiped the slate clean with the heel of his hand, and wrote again, "No matter, most ask." They finished the meal with less talk after that, though Maude found her eyes drawn again and again to the trapper across the table, to the quiet economy of his movements, the way he seemed to occupy the room without demanding anything of it. When he rose to leave, he bowed his head to her uncle, and then briefly to her, and something in that small courtly gesture, so out of place on a rough frontier trapper, lodged itself in her memory and would not leave. She did not see him again for nearly 3 weeks. Life in Split Rock filled itself quickly around Maude, the way water fills a low place in the land. She learned the rhythms of her uncle's store, the names of the ranch families who came in for supplies, the particular gossip of a town small enough that everyone's business belonged to everyone. She learned that the town doctor, a stout, kind man named Everett Marsh, had lost his wife to the same fever that had taken Alfred's voice, and that the schoolteacher, a sharp-tongued spinster named Constance Rays, kept a pistol in her desk drawer for the rattlesnakes that sometimes found their way into the schoolhouse. She learned, too, that there was a rancher's son named Otis Beckwith who had taken it upon himself to court her within a week of her arrival, appearing at the store with wildflowers and compliments that felt, to Maude, like they had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Otis was not unhandsome and not unkind, but there was a hollowness to him that Maude could not put a name to, a way his eyes moved past her toward whatever room held more important people, and she found herself, more than once, thinking of a silent man on a bay horse, and the particular way the last light had fallen across his face as they rode toward town together in a silence that had not felt empty at all. It was Silas who arranged, without quite meaning to, for Maude to see Alfred again. The old man's rheumatism had worsened with the coming of the true cold, and he asked Maude if she would ride out to Donovan's cabin with a jar of liniment and a message, for Alfred had promised him a batch of beaver pelts before the first snow closed the high trails, and Silas wanted to know if the trapper still intended to bring them down. "You are certain it is proper," Maude said, though she was already reaching for her cloak, "for me to ride out there alone?" "Donovan is as safe a man as walks this territory," Silas said. "Safer than most who talk a great deal. If you want my opinion, take the mare. Follow the creek up past the split boulder. You cannot miss the cabin." The ride out to Crooked Creek took the better part of an hour, the trail climbing steadily through stands of lodgepole pine and open meadows gone brown and brittle with the season, the mountains ahead capped already in a dusting of early snow. Maude found herself unaccountably nervous as she approached the small cabin nestled in its fold of hillside, smoke rising thin and gray from its stone chimney, a line of stretched pelts hanging to cure beneath the eaves of a lean-to. Alfred was outside when she arrived, splitting wood with an axe, and he stopped mid-swing when he saw her, setting the axe head down and wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. "My uncle sends liniment," she said, feeling suddenly foolish, sitting there on the mare with a jar clutched in her hand like an offering. "And he wishes to know if you still mean to bring the pelts down before the snow." Alfred nodded, took the jar when she held it out, and gestured for her to come down, come inside, out of the wind that had picked up and was cutting cold across the meadow. She hesitated only briefly before dismounting, tying the mare to the lean-to post, and following him into the cabin, which was small but surprisingly well kept. A single room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed along one wall, a table and 2 chairs, and shelves lined with tools and a few books, their spines worn soft with handling. He gestured for her to sit and busied himself building up the fire, and when it was crackling well he took his slate from a shelf and sat across from her at the table and wrote, "Cold ride. Coffee." "Yes, thank you," she said, and watched him move about the small space with an ease that spoke of long practice, setting a blackened pot over the flames, and she found herself studying the books on the shelf while she waited. "You read a great deal," she observed. He nodded and wrote, "Long winters, little else to do." "What do you read?" He considered this, then rose and pulled 2 volumes from the shelf, setting them before her. One was a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, the other a natural history of the Western Territories, its pages dense with illustrations of birds and mammals. Maude turned the sonnets over in her hands, surprised. "You like poetry?" He nodded again, and something in his expression, a kind of shy pride, made her smile before she could stop herself. "I would not have guessed it," she said, "of a trapper." He took the slate and wrote slowly, as if weighing each word. "A man without a voice still has thoughts. Words on a page do not care if I can speak them aloud." Maude read this twice and felt something catch in her throat that she could not quite explain. "I think that is the truest thing anyone has said to me since I came to this territory," she said quietly, "spoken or written." He looked at her for a long moment then, his creek-water eyes steady and searching, and she did not look away, and the coffee boiled over unnoticed upon the fire, and neither of them moved to save it for what felt like a very long time. She stayed longer than propriety strictly allowed that afternoon, though nothing improper passed between them, only conversation of a peculiar and halting kind, her words spoken aloud, his written upon the slate or conveyed through gesture, and by the time she rode back toward town with the fading light at her back, she understood that something had begun which she had no easy name for, and no clear notion of where it might lead. Winter came hard to Split Rock that year, the kind of winter old-timers would speak of for a decade after, with snow piling to the eaves of the smaller cabins and temperatures that turned a man's breath to frost on his own collar. Maude found herself busy through the cold months with her uncle's store and with the small society of the town, but she made excuses, more often than she would have admitted to anyone, to ride out along Crooked Creek when the weather allowed, bringing supplies, bringing news, bringing herself, though she told Silas each time it was only an errand. Alfred, for his part, began appearing in town more frequently than his trapping business strictly required, and Silas, who was no fool despite his aching joints, took to giving Maude significant looks whenever the trapper's bay gelding appeared tied outside the store. Their courtship, if it could be called that, for neither had spoken the word aloud, nor could one of them have spoken it at all, proceeded by a language of small gestures and careful attentions. Alfred brought her the first ripe currants he found along the creek in the brief thaw of a January warm spell, wrapped in a twist of paper. Maude read to him from the sonnets on the evenings he came to supper at Silas's house, for she found she loved the way he listened, his whole body still and attentive, his eyes never leaving her face. He taught her to understand the small vocabulary of signs he had built over 6 years of silence, the flat hand for wait, the 2 fingers touched to the lips then extended for thank you, the fist pressed lightly to the heart for a meaning she did not yet dare to ask him to explain, though she suspected, and the suspicion made her cheeks warm whenever she caught him making it, unconsciously, while watching her across a room. It was not, however, a courtship without obstacles. Otis Beckwith did not take kindly to a rival, particularly not one who could not, in his estimation, properly compete for a woman's affections. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a proud one, and the sight of Maude Sutton's growing fondness for a mute trapper wounded something in him that he did not know how to name except as insult. "You cannot mean to encourage him," Otis said to her one evening in February, cornering her outside the church after Sunday service, his breath fogging in the cold. "A man who cannot even speak his own name. What sort of life could he offer you, Maude? What sort of husband makes for a silent house?" "I would rather a silent house filled with kindness," Maude said, drawing her shawl tighter, "than a loud one filled with a man who thinks a woman's affections are his by right of persistence." Otis's jaw tightened. "You will be the talk of the county, a trapper who cannot even order a drink at the saloon without writing it on a slate. People will laugh at you." "Let them laugh," Maude said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. Word of this exchange, as such things do in small towns, made its way around Split Rock within days, and Maude found herself the subject of a particular kind of scrutiny she had not experienced before, some of it curious, some of it unkind. Constance Reyes, the schoolteacher, took her aside one afternoon in the store and spoke to her plainly, in the manner of a woman who had weathered her own share of judgment. "There will be talk," Constance said, "no matter what you do. Might as well let it be talk about a woman who followed her own heart, rather than one who married a fool to please the county." "You do not think it strange," Maude asked, "that I have grown fond of a man I have never heard speak a word?" "I think," Constance said, folding a length of calico with brisk, practiced hands, "that a man's voice is the least interesting thing about him in the end. My own late husband could talk the ears off a mule, and it did not make him kind, nor faithful, nor worth the years I spent listening to him. Donovan writes you letters, does he not? Brings you currants in the dead of winter, listens when you speak, truly listens, not just waiting for his turn to talk again." "Yes," Maude said softly, "he does." "Then you have found something rarer than most women in this territory ever will," Constance said, "and I would not let Otis Beckwith's wounded pride talk you out of it." Maude carried these words with her through the remainder of that hard winter, and they steadied her when the talk in town grew sharper, when she overheard, more than once, some remark about the trapper who could not even properly ask for a woman's hand, as if his silence made his affection somehow less than a man's should be. She began to understand, in those months, something of the particular injustice Alfred had lived with for 6 years. The way people spoke slower and louder to him, as if his silence meant deafness or dullness, rather than simply an absent voice. The way merchants sometimes shorted him on trade because they assumed a man who could not argue would not notice. The way children in town sometimes mocked him behind his back, though never, she noted, to his face. For there was something in his quiet bearing that discouraged outright cruelty, even as it invited a subtler condescension. She saw this most clearly one afternoon in March, when Alfred came to the store to trade a fine batch of otter pelts, and the trading clerk, a weaselly young man named Hob Prout who worked for a rival outfit passing through, attempted to cheat him on the count, speaking to him with exaggerated slowness as if to a simpleton. Maude, working behind the counter, saw Alfred's jaw tighten, saw him produce his slate and write the correct count with quick, angry strokes, saw Hob Prout laugh and wave the slate away as though it were a child scribbling. "He is trying to swindle you," Maude said loudly, stepping around the counter before she had quite decided to do so. "I counted those pelts myself not an hour past when Mr. Donovan brought them in. There are 31, not 24, and you know it well, Mr. Prout." Hob Prout's smile faltered. "Now see here, miss, this ain't your business. It is very much my business when a man is cheated in my uncle's own store," Maude said, drawing herself up with a fury that surprised even her. "You will pay him fair count, or I will see to it every rancher in this county hears how you deal with honest trappers." Hob Prout, weighing the threat of a woman's tongue against the profit of a swindle, chose the wiser course and paid the fair count, muttering under his breath as he did so, and left the store without further argument. Alfred watched this entire exchange with an expression Maude could not quite read, and when the clerk had gone, he took up his slate and wrote slowly. "You did not need to do that." "I wanted to," Maude said simply. "It was not right what he was doing." Alfred looked at her for a long moment, and then wrote something and immediately erased it before she could read it, his hand hesitating over the slate, and she wondered, watching him, what word he had thought better of showing her. Spring came late that year, but it came, the snow retreating up the mountainsides in slow increments, the creek swelling with runoff, the meadows around Split Rock filling with wild flowers, lupin and paintbrush, and the small yellow blooms the old-timers called buttercups, though they were something else entirely. It was in this season, with the world softening around them, that Alfred Donovan began, in his careful and wordless way, to court Maude Sutton in earnest. He took her riding along the high meadows above Crooked Creek, showing her where the elk gathered in the early mornings, teaching her to be still and patient, to let the wild things come to her rather than chasing them away with noise and hurry. She found in his company a kind of peace she had not known in Ohio, where her days had been filled with the small, constant chatter of her aunt's household, and she began to understand something of what Constance Ray's had meant. That silence, properly shared, was its own kind of intimacy, deeper perhaps than words could manage. It was on one such ride in the last week of May, with the meadow grass green and new, and the aspen leaves just unfurling silver green above them, that Alfred first tried, in his own way, to tell her what she had come to mean to him. They had stopped to rest the horses near a small stand of aspen, and Alfred had dismounted to check a trap he kept along the creek there, and when he returned he found Maude sitting on a fallen log, her bonnet loosened, her face turned up to the sun with an expression of such simple contentment that he stopped several paces away, unwilling to disturb it. She sensed him watching and opened her eyes. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head and came to sit beside her on the log, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long while neither of them spoke, nor needed to, the creek chattering below them and a red-tailed hawk wheeling slow circles overhead. Then Alfred took out his slate and wrote upon it with evident care and turned it toward her. "I have thought a great deal," it read, "about what a man with no voice has to offer a woman like you." Maude's breath caught. "Alfred," she began, but he shook his head, asking her wordlessly to let him finish, and took the slate back to write more. "I cannot tell you the things other men might tell you. I cannot sing to you or whisper to you in the dark or call your name across a crowded room. I have only my hands and what they can make, and my eyes and what they can see. And I have looked at you, Maude, since the first evening on the trail, and I have not stopped seeing you since." She read this through twice, her eyes stinging with a sudden and unexpected fullness, and when she looked up at him, he was watching her with such naked vulnerability that she reached out and took his hand, the one that had written those words, and held it between both of hers. "You have never needed a voice to tell me anything that mattered," she said, her own voice unsteady. "I have understood you better in these months of silence than I understood most men in Ohio who talked from dawn until dusk. I do not want a man who fills the air with noise, Alfred Donovan. I want a man who fills it with meaning, however he manages to do so." He looked at her, then with an expression she had not seen on him before, something raw and hopeful and afraid all at once, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that made her whole arm tremble, and though he could not say the words, she understood, in the language they had built together over that long winter and into this new spring, exactly what he meant to say, and she leaned forward and kissed him. There on the fallen log, with the creek singing below and the hawk still circling above, and the world, for a long, sweet moment, held nothing but the two of them. It was some weeks after this, in the full flush of June, that the trouble began which would test the fragile happiness they had built. Maude's father, a stern and practical man named Reginald Sutton, who had remained in Ohio to manage the family's modest dry goods business, had written to Silas some months prior expressing his hope that Maude would make a suitable match in the territory, by which he meant, though he did not say so plainly, a match of some standing and prosperity, for Reginald Sutton had ambitions for his daughter that extended beyond the modest circumstances of a frontier trapper's cabin. When word reached him, through the slow and imperfect channel of letters carried by stage and rail across half a continent, that his daughter had grown attached to a mute trapper of no particular fortune, he did not take the news well, and in the last week of June, to everyone's considerable surprise, Reginald Sutton himself arrived in Split Rock, having traveled by train to the nearest rail station, and thence by hired coach, to see for himself what foolishness his daughter had gotten herself into. Reginald was a man of middling height but considerable presence, accustomed to being obeyed in his own household, and he wasted no time upon his arrival in making his opinions known. "A mute," he said to Maude on the evening of his arrival, pacing the small parlor of Silas's house while Maude sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, "a trapper of no education and no fortune, who cannot even speak to ask your hand properly. Maude, I did not send you west to throw yourself away on the first rough man who crossed your path." "He did not cross my path by accident," Maude said, striving to keep her voice level. "He saved me when my wagon broke down on the road, and he has shown me more kindness and more genuine regard in these 8 months than any man I met in 3 years in Ohio, father, including the ones you thought so suitable. Kindness does not put food on a table nor a roof that does not leak," Reginald said. "What has he to offer you truly? A cabin in the mountains and a life of silence." "He has a good trade, father," Silas interjected from his chair by the fire where he had been listening with growing discomfort. "Donovan is no pauper. He sells more pelts in a season than most trappers in this territory, and he has money saved, I would wager, more than most young men in Split Rock who talk a good deal more than he does." "That is not the point," Reginald said, though his certainty wavered slightly at this information. "The point is suitability and standing, and whether a man who cannot speak can properly provide for a household, can properly represent a family in society. There is not a great deal of society to represent oneself to out here," Maude said, with more heat than she intended. "And as for suitability, father, I would remind you that you sent me west specifically to escape the suitable arrangement you had already half made for me with Mr. Cordwainer's son, who I will remind you drinks to excess, and has already, at 23, the beginnings of his father's gout." This struck close enough to a truth that Reginald had no ready answer, and the argument dissolved, for that evening, into an uneasy silence. But Maude understood that her father would not be so easily dissuaded, and she rode out to Crooked Creek the following morning with a heavy heart to tell Alfred what had come to pass. She found him mending a section of fence near the cabin, and when she told him of her father's arrival and his objections, relayed in careful detail. Alfred set down his tools and listened with the particular stillness she had come to know meant he was absorbing something difficult. When she had finished, he took up his slate. "Your father is not wrong to want better for you than a silent trapper's cabin." "Do not say that," Maude said fiercely. "Do not you dare say that to me, Alfred Donovan, as though you believe it yourself." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something so raw and uncertain in his face that her anger softened into something more tender. He wrote again, more slowly this time. "I have thought since we began this that I have nothing proper to offer, no words to ask you rightly. No ring, no fine words, no proper courtship such as your father would expect for his daughter. Only a cabin and traps and a silence he is right to distrust. Alfred." She crossed to him and took the slate from his hands, setting it aside, and took both his hands in hers instead. "I do not care one whit for fine words. I have had fine words spoken to me by men who meant nothing by them. I care for a man who listens, who is patient, who has shown me more true regard in silence than any talker I have known in speech. If my father cannot see the worth in that, then the fault lies in his understanding, not in your worth." Alfred's throat worked, a strange, wordless motion, as if he were straining against the silence that had bound him for 6 years, trying to force some sound past the place where his voice had once lived. And for a moment Maude thought wildly that he might actually speak, but no sound came, only a rough exhale and something in his eyes that was almost grief. "I do not need you to speak," she said softly, seeing this struggle and understanding it for what it was. "I need only you as you are." He pulled her close then and held her, and though he could not tell her in words what that meant to him, she felt it in the fierce tightness of his embrace, in the way his hands trembled slightly against her back, and she understood that this, too, was its own kind of language, perhaps the truest one they had between them. But Reginald Sutton was not a man easily won over, and in the days that followed he pursued a strategy of persistent objection, enlisting even Otis Beckwith, whom he had met at church and found agreeable in his ambitions if not his manner, to press the case for a more suitable match. It was Otis, in fact, who brought the matter to its crisis point, for in his wounded pride and his eagerness to see Reginald's favor turned his way, he did something that would nearly cost Maude and Alfred everything they had built. There was, that summer, a persistent trouble in the territory with a band of horse thieves who had been working the ranches along the eastern slope of the Wind River Range, stealing stock under cover of darkness and driving them north toward the railhead where they could be sold before word of the theft caught up with them. The local sheriff, a weathered old lawman named Garrett Boone, had been struggling for months to catch the culprits, and Otis Beckwith, seeing an opportunity to both curry favor with Reginald Sutton and discredit his rival in one stroke, went to Sheriff Boone with a fabricated tale, claiming he had seen Alfred Donovan driving stolen horses near Crooked Creek under cover of night. It was a lie built on the ugliest kind of prejudice, the assumption that a man who could not speak in his own defense would find it harder to clear his name, and Otis had judged, correctly as it happened, that his own word as a rancher's son would carry weight against a silent trapper's, whatever the truth of the matter. Sheriff Boone, though he had known Alfred for years and thought well of him, was obligated to investigate any credible accusation of horse theft, for it was a hanging offense in that territory in those years, and stolen stock could mean ruin for a small rancher. He rode out to Crooked Creek with 2 deputies on a hot July morning, and found Alfred at his cabin, and informed him, not unkindly but firmly, that he would need to come into town to answer questions about the missing horses from the Halloran Ranch, which had been taken 3 nights prior. Alfred, of course, could offer no verbal protest, no immediate explanation, and though he wrote furiously upon his slate that he had been nowhere near the Halloran Ranch, that he had spent those 3 nights checking his trap lines along the upper creek, alone, with no one to witness his whereabouts, the sheriff explained, not without sympathy, that a written claim from the accused himself was not the same as independent testimony, and that Alfred would need to remain in town, under a loose form of custody, until the matter could be properly investigated. Word reached Maude within the hour, carried by a breathless boy from the livery who had seen the sheriff bring Alfred in, and she left the store at a run, her uncle calling after her in confusion, and found Alfred sitting on a bench outside the small jailhouse, his hands bound loosely, more a formality than a true restraint, given that Sheriff Boone did not truly believe him dangerous, but a formality that nonetheless burned Maude with a fury she had rarely felt in her life. "This is absurd," she said to Sheriff Boone, who stood nearby looking uncomfortable. "Alfred Donovan has never stolen so much as a loaf of bread in his life. Who has accused him?" "I cannot say who brought the information, Miss Sutton," the sheriff said, "only that it was credible enough I could not ignore it. He will have his chance to answer for himself, and if the evidence does not bear out, he will be released with my apology." "How can a man answer for himself who cannot speak?" Maude said, her voice rising, "when the very accusation depends on someone else's word against silence? You know this is not right, Sheriff Boone." "I know it is not comfortable," the sheriff said, "but the law does not much care for comfort, Miss Sutton. If he is innocent, and I have known him some years and would wager he is, then the truth will come clear soon enough." Maude turned to Alfred, who sat with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on some distant point, the particular stillness of a man enduring an injustice. He has no ready means to fight, and something in his posture, the way 6 years of a world that too often mistook his silence for guilt or dullness, seemed to settle onto his shoulders in that moment, broke something loose in her chest. "I will find out who did this," she told him fiercely, crouching before him and taking his bound hands in hers, uncaring of who watched. "I promise you, Alfred, I will find the truth of this, and I will see you cleared." He looked at her, and though he could say nothing, his eyes carried a depth of gratitude and fear and something else, something that looked almost like shame, as if some part of him wondered whether even she might come to doubt him under the weight of accusation. And she understood, seeing that flicker of doubt, exactly how much courage it must have taken him, all these years, to trust anyone at all. She spent that afternoon and the following day in a fever of activity, questioning everyone she could find who might know something of the Halloran horse theft. It was Constance Reyes in the end, who provided the crucial piece of the puzzle, having overheard, quite by accident, Otis Beckwith boasting to a friend at the saloon that he had fixed the trapper's wagon good, a boast made carelessly in his cups and repeated to Maude with careful precision by the schoolteacher, who had no love for injustice of any kind. Armed with this, and with a memory of Otis's wounded pride from their earlier confrontation, Maude went not to the sheriff first, but to her own father, understanding correctly that Reginald Sutton, whatever his objections to Alfred as a match for his daughter, was a man who valued honesty and fair dealing above all else, and would not countenance a lie told to ruin an innocent man, however inconvenient that innocent man's innocence might be to his own preferences. "Otis Beckwith lied to the sheriff," she told her father plainly, in the parlor of Silas's house, "to see Alfred hanged or driven from the territory, so that he might clear the field for himself with your blessing." Constance Reyes heard him boasting of it at the saloon. "Whatever you think of Alfred as a suitor, father, I know you are not a man who would see an innocent man punished to satisfy another man's jealousy." Reginald Sutton was silent for a long moment, his face working through some private calculation, and then he said gruffly, "No, I am not such a man, whatever else you may think of my objections. Take me to this sheriff." Together, father and daughter went to Sheriff Boone and laid out what Constance had overheard, and the sheriff, who had already begun to have his doubts about a story that placed a solitary trapper 3 miles from the Halloran ranch with no one to witness the theft itself, agreed to bring Otis Beckwith in for questioning. Under the sheriff's steady pressure, and faced with the threat of a charge of false accusation, which carried its own serious consequences, Otis's story crumbled within the hour. and he admitted, red-faced and sullen, that he had fabricated the sighting entirely, that he had never seen Alfred anywhere near the Halloran Ranch, that he had said what he said only to see his rival removed from his path. The true horse thieves, as it happened, were caught not 2 weeks later, a pair of drifters working out of a hidden camp in the Badlands to the north, and the matter of the Halloran horses was closed for good. But the damage Otis had attempted to do lingered in the town's memory for some time, a cautionary tale of the particular cruelty of using a man's silence as a weapon against him. Alfred was released that same evening, and Sheriff Boone, to his credit, offered a public apology at the following Sunday service, standing before the congregation to admit that he had allowed prejudice against a man's silence to cloud his judgment of the evidence, and that he was heartily ashamed of it, and would strive to do better by every man in his charge regardless of how loud or quiet his voice might be. It was, Maude thought, watching Alfred receive this apology with his usual quiet dignity, as close to a full accounting as their small frontier justice could offer, and it seemed to satisfy something in the town's conscience, for the talk against Alfred quieted considerably in the weeks that followed, and even Reginald Sutton, watching the whole affair unfold, seemed to undergo some private reckoning of his own. It was 3 days after Alfred's release that Reginald Sutton rode out, alone and without informing his daughter of his intention, to Crooked Creek, to speak with the trapper man to man, or as near to man as their circumstances allowed. He found Alfred at work skinning a hide near the lean-to, and the trapper straightened at his approach, wary but not hostile, and reached for his slate out of long habit, but Reginald held up a hand. "No need for that yet," Reginald said, and dismounted, standing somewhat awkwardly in the yard, a man clearly unaccustomed to the particular etiquette required by a conversation with someone who could not answer aloud. "I have come to say I was wrong to doubt you, Mr. Donovan. A man does not need a voice to be honest, and you have proven yourself more honest than the man who accused you, who had a voice and used it only for lies." Alfred inclined his head, accepting this with the same quiet grace he brought to most things. "My daughter loves you," Reginald continued, and there was something almost helpless in the admission, the sound of a father recognizing a battle already lost. "I have watched her these past days, fighting for you when you could not fight for yourself, and I have not seen that fire in her before, not for any man I have paraded before her in Ohio. I do not fully understand what she sees, I will admit that plainly, but I am not so blind a man that I cannot see it is real." He paused, seeming to gather himself, and then said more formally, "I came to ask, Mr. Donovan, whether your intentions toward my daughter are honorable, and whether you mean to make something permanent of this courtship, for I will not have her heart trifled with, silent man or no." Alfred took up his slate then and wrote, taking his time, and when he turned it toward Reginald, the older man read, "I love your daughter more than I have words to say, which I suppose is a strange thing for a man like me to claim, having no words at all. But I mean to ask her to marry me, if you will permit it, and I mean to spend what life I have making certain she never regrets choosing a silent man over all the talkers who might have offered her less." Reginald read this through twice, and something in his stern face softened considerably. "Well," he said, clearing his throat against some unexpected thickness there, "you have my permission, Mr. Donovan, though I suspect you would have asked her regardless of what I said." Alfred's mouth curved into the ghost of a smile, and he inclined his head again, and Reginald, in a gesture that surprised them both, extended his hand, and Alfred shook it firmly, and something was settled between them that needed no words at all. It was that same week, with his future father-in-law's blessing secured and the accusation against him cleared, that Alfred Donovan began the work that would become the truest expression of everything he could not say aloud. He had, some months before, taken from a bull elk he had harvested for winter meat a great curving antler, and had set it aside in his cabin for no particular purpose he could have named at the time, save that the bone was fine-grained and pale as old ivory, and something in him had wanted to keep it rather than discard it with the rest of the carcass's remains. Now, in the long evenings of that July, he took a small knife with a blade honed to a fine edge, and began, with the same patient care he brought to every task of his solitary life, to carve. He had no jeweler's training, no proper tools beyond his trapping knife, and a small file he used for sharpening traps, and the work was slow and exacting, for elk horn is a dense and stubborn material, requiring a steady hand and enormous patience to shape into anything fine. He worked by firelight after his daily labors were done, shaving the antler down in careful increments, smoothing it with sand, and then with the softest leather he owned, shaping a narrow band that would fit Maude's finger, for he had, with a trapper's careful attention to detail, taken note of the size of her hands during the months of their courtship, and he set into the band, with a delicacy that seemed almost impossible given his rough materials, a small design of interlocking lines that echoed. Though she would not know this until he told her, the pattern of aspen leaves in the grove where he had first tried to tell her what she meant to him. It took him the better part of 2 weeks, working every evening until his eyes ached in the firelight, and when it was finished he held it up and turned it in the light, a simple pale ring, humble by the standards of any jeweler in a city, but made entirely by his own hands, with no words to smooth its imperfections, only care and patience, and the particular devotion of a man who could not tell a woman he loved her, and so had resolved to show her instead. He rode into Split Rock on the first Sunday of August, the ring wrapped in a scrap of soft doeskin and tucked into his coat pocket, his heart, though it made no sound, hammering as loud in his chest as any man's had ever hammered before a proposal. He found Maude at her uncle's store, helping to arrange a new shipment of dry goods, and when she saw him her whole face lit with the particular warmth she reserved only for him, and she came around the counter at once. "Alfred, I did not expect you until Tuesday." He shook his head and gestured for her to come outside, and something in his manner, a kind of contained urgency, made her set down the bolt of cloth in her hands and follow him without further question. He led her not far, only to the small stand of cottonwoods behind the church, where the creek that fed into Crooked Creek further upstream ran shallow and clear over smooth stones, and the late afternoon light fell golden through the leaves, and there he stopped, and turned to face her and took her hands in his. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and she saw in his face the particular struggle she had witnessed once before, in the meadow above the cabin, the strain of a man wanting desperately to speak and finding only silence where words should be. His throat worked, and this time, unlike before, a sound did come, rough and broken and unpracticed, barely more than a strained exhalation shaped crudely around the ghost of a word, but a sound nonetheless, the first sound she had ever heard him make in all their months together. "Maude," he said, or something so close to her name that there could be no mistaking his intention, the word emerging cracked and strange from a throat that had not shaped speech in 6 long years, and the effort of it left him trembling, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Maude's own eyes filled instantly, her hands flying to cover her mouth in shock and overwhelming tenderness. "Alfred," she breathed. "You spoke." He shook his head quickly, as if to say it was not truly speech, not really, only a broken sound forced out by desperate will, but she would not let him diminish it, gripping his hands tighter. "You said my name," she said, tears spilling freely now. "However it came out, you said my name, and I will treasure that sound for the rest of my life, Alfred Donovan, whether you ever manage another word or not." He reached then into his coat pocket, his hands shaking slightly, and drew out the small ring wrapped in doeskin, and unwrapped it with careful fingers, and held it out to her upon his open palm, the pale elk horn catching the last gold light of the afternoon, and he looked at her with an expression that needed no words at all, that asked, as plainly as any spoken proposal ever could, the question every part of his being had been building toward for the better part of a year. "Oh," Maude said softly, looking at the ring, at the careful pattern of leaves carved into its narrow band, at the evidence of 2 weeks of patient, silent labor made visible in every smooth curve of the bone. "Oh, Alfred, did you make this yourself?" He nodded. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she said, and meant it entirely, for she had received gifts of gold and silver from suitors in Ohio who thought a fine bauble might purchase her affection, and none of them had ever moved her as this simple ring of elk horn moved her now, understanding as she did every ounce of devotion and patience it represented. "Yes," she said, before he could even find a way to ask the question properly, understanding that the ring itself was the asking. "Yes, Alfred, I will marry you. I will marry you 1,000 times over if you ask me 1,000 times, silent or not." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled, and it fit perfectly, for he had measured her hand carefully in his mind across months of quiet observation, and when it was settled in place, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her fingers. And then, releasing her hand, he cupped her face and kissed her properly, there beneath the cottonwoods with the creek singing beside them, and Maude Sutton felt, in that kiss, every word he had never been able to say. Felt them as clearly as if he had shouted them from the rooftops of Split Rock, and understood that she had found, in this quiet man's silence, a language more eloquent than any voice she had ever heard. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright September afternoon, in the small, leaning steepled church of Split Rock, with the whole town turned out to witness it, for word of the elk horn ring and the broken, hard-won sound of Alfred's voice speaking her name had traveled through the community with the particular speed such stories acquire in small frontier towns, and there was not a dry eye among the women present, nor a few among the men. When the minister asked if there was any objection to the union and none was raised, and asked Alfred if he took Maude Sutton to be his wife, and Alfred, straining with every ounce of will he possessed, managed to force out a second broken word. Rough and halting but unmistakable, "I do," that brought a fresh wave of tears through the small congregation. Maude's father walked her down the short aisle himself, his earlier objections entirely dissolved into a kind of proud, if still slightly bemused, acceptance, and Silas Whitfield stood as best man, having grown to love the quiet trapper as near to a son as his own circumstances had ever allowed, and Constance Reyes played the small church's out-of-tune piano with more enthusiasm than skill, and Sheriff Garrett Boone stood near the back with his hat in his hands, still carrying some private guilt over the injustice he had nearly allowed to be done, and found in the ceremony a measure of peace regarding it. Otis Beckwith did not attend, having left the county some weeks prior for a ranching venture in Montana Territory, his pride too wounded by the whole affair to remain in a town that had witnessed his disgrace, though word reached Split Rock some years later that he had married respectably and settled into a life that seemed to suit him better than the pursuit of a woman who had never truly wanted him. The wedding night was spent in the small cabin along Crooked Creek, which Alfred had spent the preceding weeks expanding, adding a second room with his own hands, working late into the evenings after his trapping duties were done, wanting to give his new wife a home that reflected the fullness of his devotion rather than the bare necessities of a bachelor's solitary life. Maude found, upon arriving as a bride to that small mountain home, that he had also built her a proper writing desk, understanding that she loved to write letters to her family in Ohio and might wish for a fine surface upon which to compose them, and had lined a shelf with pressed wildflowers preserved between sheets of paper, a record, she realized with a fresh swell of tenderness, of every season of their courtship, the currants of January, the lupin of May, the paintbrush of June. Each flower a wordless diary of a love that had grown entirely without the ordinary vocabulary of romance, built instead from patience and attention, and the thousand small kindnesses of a man determined to show since he could not say exactly how deeply he cared. Their life together in the years that followed was not without its ordinary hardships, for frontier living offered little in the way of ease, but it was, by every account that mattered, a happy one. Alfred continued his trapping through the following winters, though he took on, at Maude's gentle urging, fewer of the most dangerous high-country expeditions, wanting to be present for the family they both hoped to build. Maude, for her part, took over much of the correspondence and trading arrangements for Alfred's furs, finding that her sharp tongue and quick mind, the same qualities that had faced down a swindling clerk in her uncle's store, served the family's business interests well, negotiating fair prices with the fur buyers who came through Split Rock twice yearly, and none of them dared attempt to cheat Alfred Donovan again. Not with his wife standing at his side with a ledger book and a memory for numbers that put most merchants to shame. Their first child, a son, was born in the autumn of 1879, a little more than a year after Maude's wagon had broken down on the road outside Split Rock, and they named him Silas, after the uncle who had brought them together, though neither of them ever said so plainly, understanding it as one more thing that needed no words to be true. Silas Donovan grew into a sturdy, watchful boy who, to his parents' quiet delight, seemed to inherit something of his father's patient stillness, alongside his mother's quick curiosity, and who learned, almost before he learned to speak proper sentences himself, the small vocabulary of signs his father used, so that the household came to possess its own private language, spoken partly aloud by Maude and partly through gesture by Alfred. A blending that felt to all who witnessed it less like a limitation than a peculiar richness. A second child, a daughter they named Ruth, arrived 2 years later, in the spring of 1881, born in the same small cabin that had by then grown, through years of steady expansion, into a proper farmhouse with 4 rooms and a wide porch that looked out over Crooked Creek toward the mountains where Alfred still ran his trap lines each winter, though he had by then begun teaching young Silas the trade as well, the boy trailing after his father through the aspen groves with a child's serious concentration, learning to read the tracks and signs of the wild things the way his father had learned before him. Alfred's voice never fully returned to him, though over the years, through some combination of will and the slow healing of whatever damage the long-ago fever had done, he managed to force out a small handful of additional words, rough and effortful but treasured beyond measure by his family, each child's name eventually joining Maude's in the small collection of sounds he could produce. And though he remained, for all practical purposes, a man who lived mostly in silence, that silence never again felt to him like a lack, for he had found, in the family gathered around him each evening at the supper table, a fullness of communication that had nothing to do with the number of words a man could speak and everything to do with the depth of attention he brought to every person he loved. Maude, for her part, never once regretted the choice that had scandalized half of Split Rock and troubled her own father for a season, for she found in her marriage to Alfred Donovan a partnership built on a foundation rarer than most marriages in that hard frontier territory ever achieved. A habit of truly seeing and being seen, of communicating not through the easy currency of casual chatter, but through the harder-won language of attention and patience and care. She kept the elk horn ring on her finger every day of her life thereafter, and when, years later, her daughter Ruth asked her, as a young girl full of curious questions, why her ring was not gold or silver like other women's, Maude told her the whole story, of the broken wagon axle and the silent trapper on the bay horse, of the swindling clerk and the false accusation of horse theft, of the 2 weeks of patient carving by firelight and the broken, precious sound of her own name forced out of a throat that had been silent for 6 long years, and Ruth listened to the whole tale with wide, rapt eyes, and declared, with the particular certainty of an 8-year-old, that she wanted a love story, exactly like her mother's when she grew up, though Maude, laughing, told her she hoped Ruth's road to love might prove somewhat less eventful, even as she privately thought there was no love story she would have traded for her own, not for all the easy courtships and smooth-talking suitors in the whole of Ohio. Split Rock itself grew steadily through those years, as the territory around it filled with more ranches and more families drawn west by the promise of land and opportunity. And by the time Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, the town boasted a proper schoolhouse where Constance Rays still taught, a second church, and a railroad spur that connected it at last to the wider commerce of the nation. Silas Whitfield lived to see his grandnephew Silas Donovan grow to nearly 10 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1888. Having lived long enough to see the niece he had brought west find a happiness he had not dared to hope for on that first day, her broken wagon had brought Alfred Donovan into her life, and his general store passed, by his own careful arrangement, into Maude and Alfred's hands, giving the family a second source of livelihood beyond the trapping trade, one that Maude, with her quick mind for business, managed with considerable success, expanding its stock and its reputation until Whitfield's General Store, as it continued to be called in honor of the old man, became known as the finest supplier of goods for 100 miles in any direction. Alfred Donovan lived to see his son Silas grow into a young man who took over much of the trapping trade in his own right, and his daughter Ruth grow into a young woman as sharp-tongued and warm-hearted as her mother had been at that same age. And he lived long enough, too, to welcome a third child, a second son they named Everett after the town doctor who had delivered all 3 children safely into the world, born in 1884 when Maude was 30 and Alfred 31. Rounding out a family that filled the farmhouse along Crooked Creek with a warmth and noise that no one who had known the silent trapper's solitary cabin of 1878 could have predicted. Sheriff Garrett Boone remained in his post for another decade, and in his later years, when younger lawmen took over the daily business of keeping peace in a growing county, he was known to tell the story of Alfred Donovan's wrongful arrest to any new deputy who showed signs of judging a man too quickly by the loudness of his protest or the smoothness of his speech, using it, in his gruff way, as a lesson in the particular injustice that could be done to those who could not easily speak for themselves, and how the truth, patiently pursued, generally found its way to light regardless. Otis Beckwith's fate, as it reached Split Rock through the occasional letter or traveler's report, proved neither tragic nor triumphant but simply ordinary, a life of modest success in Montana Territory, a marriage that seemed contented enough, and no further contact with the woman he had once tried, through lies and manipulation, to separate from the man she loved, though it was said, in the way such things are always said in small communities with long memories, that he never spoke of his time in Split Rock without a certain reticence that suggested the shame of that episode had never entirely left him, a fitting enough consequence, Maude sometimes thought, for a man who had tried to use another's silence as a weapon and had instead revealed the poverty of his own character in the process. As for Alfred and Maude themselves, they grew old together along Crooked Creek in the manner of couples who have built their happiness on a foundation too solid for the ordinary erosions of time to trouble much. And though the years brought their share of hardships, a bad winter in 1886 that nearly took the whole family with a fever that reminded Alfred too keenly of the illness that had stolen his voice so many years before. A difficult season in 1891, when beaver pelts fell out of fashion in the eastern markets, and the trapping trade slowed considerably, forcing the family to lean more heavily on the general store's steady income. They weathered each trouble together with the same patient partnership that had carried them through their courtship. Maude's quick words and sharper mind for practical solutions, balanced always against Alfred's steady hands and deep well of patience, each supplying what the other lacked, each finding in the other's particular strengths a completion neither had known they were missing before that autumn day in 1878, when a broken wagon axle had brought a mute trapper and a determined young woman together on a darkening prairie road. In the final accounting, which is to say in the story that Maude Sutton Donovan told her grandchildren decades later, sitting on the wide porch of the farmhouse along Crooked Creek with the mountain still standing sentinel in the distance and the Elkhorn ring, worn smooth now with decades of daily wear, still circling her finger, she would always return to that first evening. The silent man on the bay horse who had asked, with nothing more than a gesture, whether she was hurt, and who had spent every year since proving, in 1,000 small and patient ways, that a man did not need a voice to speak the deepest truths a heart could hold. She would tell them of the carving by firelight, of the 2 weeks of patient labor that had produced a ring no jeweler could have matched for the love folded into every curve of its pale bone, and she would tell them, too, of the broken, precious sound of her own name, the first word Alfred Donovan had managed to force from a throat silent for 6 long years, offered to her beneath the cottonwoods on a golden August afternoon, and she would tell them that this, more than any grand romantic speech any smooth-talking suitor had ever offered her in Ohio, remained the truest declaration of love she had ever received, precisely because it had cost him everything he had to give it, every ounce of will and struggle a silent man could summon, all of it poured into a single word that meant, in the end, everything. Alfred Donovan died in the winter of 1922, at the age of 69, having lived a long life full of quiet contentment, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up understanding, without ever needing it explained, that their grandfather's silence was not an absence but a different kind of fullness, a man who communicated love through action and attention rather than through easy words, and who had taught them all, in his own patient way, that the truest things in life rarely needed to be spoken, allowed to be understood. Maude survived him by 6 years, and in that time she never once removed the Elkhorn ring from her finger, wearing it until the day of her own passing in 1928, at which point, by her own careful instruction, it was given to her granddaughter Eleanor, Silas's youngest daughter, who wore it at her own wedding some years later, understanding it not merely as an heirloom but as a promise passed down through generations. That love built on patience and true attention could outlast any hardship the wild frontier, or the passing of long years, might bring against it. And so the story of the mute trapper and the determined young woman who had come west to keep her uncle's house, and had found instead a love that needed no words at all to make itself understood, passed into the particular kind of legend that small frontier towns preserve and treasure, told and retold around fires, and at gatherings for generations after, a reminder to all who heard it that the deepest truths of the heart are rarely the ones spoken loudest, but rather the ones offered most patiently, most faithfully, and most completely, in whatever language a person has been given to speak it, whether that language be words or gestures or the careful, patient carving of a ring from elk horn offered on an open palm beneath the cottonwoods, when a man who had no words left had found, in the end, that he did not need them at all.